She had no ability to fight for herself. She was completely railroaded by this setup. And if the constitutional procedures would have been followed, Britney would probably never have been put into this conservatorship.
Oh God. Why is this conservatorship unconstitutional? We hear that word all the time. Like, what do you mean by that?
So the conservatorship was implemented while Britney was in an involuntary psychiatric hold. That means she was not allowed to appear in front of the court. She was not allowed to make her case. She was not allowed to argue for herself. And she also didn't really even get any notice that this conservatorship hearing was happening. The reason that that's important is because as United States citizens, we are afforded certain fundamental rights and liberties, and in particular, the United States Constitution in the first 10 amendments, it's called the Bill of Rights, lays out some very important rights that we all are supposed to have as American citizens. The First Amendment right, a lot of people will have heard of, the right to free speech, freedom of speech. But the First Amendment also protects your right to practice whatever religion you want, associate with who you want, meaning you can go and be friends with whoever you want. You have a constitutional right to do that. The Second Amendment protects your right to keep and bear arms. It gives American citizens the right to become a well-regulated militia, quite literally to protect ourselves from the government and from tyranny. The Third Amendment, it was kind of like the legs of that one were kicked out from under it pretty shortly after. The Fourth Amendment protects your right against illegal searches of your property, or illegal seizure rather. So, search and seizure are the Fourth and Fifth Amendment, and they work together, so it's kind of complicated to tease them out. But for the purposes of this video, the Fourth and Fifth Amendment of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights work together to keep the government from being able to illegally search and seize your property and your own body. So when you are under arrest, for example, when you are being handcuffed and you are being charged with a crime or being brought in for questioning for a crime, certain rights kick in that will allow you some protection from the government. If you're in jail somewhere, it's unconstitutional for a police officer to just go into your house and start digging around, right? That's an illegal search, and you've been seized. Or if a police officer is to walk up to you and just take some of your property without having any probable cause that you're committing a crime or anything like that, that's unconstitutional. He's illegally seized some of your property. It's no different than anyone else coming and stealing your property at that point. There's certain protections that are in place. The Fifth Amendment also, in addition to this illegal search and seizure thing, affords you due process, which is the opportunity to have notice or be notified when the government may take away some of your right. And due process also consists of the opportunity to be heard. So that means you have the right as an American citizen to know that the government is going to take your rights away and to argue in your own defense and say, listen, no, this doesn't need to happen to me. That's what due process is. Due process is protected by the Fifth Amendment. Another thing that the Fifth Amendment protects is your right against self-incrimination, right? I plead the Fifth. You're pleading the Fifth Amendment, the Miranda warnings, right? You have the right to an attorney, and they tell you all this stuff, right? You have the right to remain silent. Anything that you say can be held against you and will be held against you in a court of law. That's where that comes from. Those warnings come from the Fifth Amendment. And so when people say, I plead the Fifth, they're talking about the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Then you have the Sixth Amendment right to counsel. There's some other stuff that goes in with the Sixth Amendment, but for me, the most important part for the Britney case is that it allows you to choose your own counsel and to be represented by counsel if, again, the government is going to take away any of your rights, which has happened to Britney. The Seventh Amendment, I'm not really sure what's going on with that one, to be honest. The Eighth Amendment is, I believe, cruel and unusual punishment, right? Then you have the Ninth, 10th Amendments. You start to get around to the Civil Rights Amendment that outlaw slavery and human ownership. And it's interesting because even in the Constitution, there is a little bit of an escape hatch in the 13th Amendment that says you're not allowed to own other humans. You're not allowed to take away other humans' liberty unless they've committed a crime. And so even in our Constitution, we have it kind of built in there that we will take away people's freedoms if they committed a crime. And it kind of begs the question, which is really tangential at this point, Why is it that we get to determine to take away people's freedoms even if they committed a crime? I mean, maybe that is what we want to do, but it's just something to think about. And then the other really important amendment here is the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment guarantees due process, right? So due process is something that you can use against your own state government and the federal government. So that's how the 5th and the 14th Amendment operate together to make whatever you can do to the federal government, you can do it to the state government if they're violating your constitutional rights. Equally as importantly is the 14th Amendment protects everybody equally under the law. So the 14th Amendment is one of those civil rights amendments, and it comes in and it says, basically, I don't care what color you are, what race, national origin. The 14th Amendment says you are allowed equal protection under the law. It's not, oh, the law applies to everyone except disabled people. No. The 14th Amendment gives you equal protection under the law. So now that we did that little overview, what can we learn from Britney's case? The First Amendment, right to freedom of speech, well, she hasn't been able to speak. Another citizen cannot violate your constitutional rights. Constitutional violations happen when the government or the state takes away your rights. And that means police officers, judges, courts in general, legislatures. A lot of times it ends up being courts, right? But sometimes it can even be a public school suppressing free speech, stuff like that. It really has to be someone that's kind of stepped into the shoes and acting as the government. In Britney's case, that is most definitely going to be the Los Angeles probate court. Viva K. Bob, Reva Gates, Brenda Penny, and whoever else would have been acting in those ways. It could also be the police officers who swarmed Britney's house and didn't give her a lot of option of whether they went in. It's been argued that was an illegal search and seizure whenever those police officers showed up to Britney's house and illegally entered into her home without a search warrant. You need a search warrant to enter into the private property. And, it's been argued that that was a violation of her rights. First Amendment freedom of speech rights have been suppressed by the government. I mean, Britney has said she wanted to speak in court before, and that wasn't honored, right? The freedom of association, the court has allowed her dad to take away her right to hang out with her friends. So that's the freedom of association. The Second Amendment right to bear arms. I don't know if Britney is allowed to own a gun. If I had to guess, she's not. The Fourth Amendment, illegal search and seizure. Is it constitutional that they were allowed to take Britney from her home, enter her home, look and search for things, possibly take things out of her home, force her to leave her home, right? Was that legal of them? I'm not sure that they had a warrant to do that. The Fifth Amendment due process protection, when it was attached to the 14th Amendment, would come in and would say, well, this conservatorship was implemented while Britney was in this involuntary psychiatric hold. She didn't have those two components of due process that are necessary: notice and opportunity to be heard. The notice requirement was waived. She was supposed to have 5 days notice under the state of California's constitution, and she didn't get any notice. She was supposed to be able to have someone to advocate for her on her behalf, speak for herself or hire a lawyer. That wasn't given her, so there was no due process. The Fifth Amendment right to due process is not there. The Sixth Amendment right to hire your own lawyer. Britney did actually, despite not having any notice, despite not having the due process that was required, she still came out and had a lawyer show up for her who was kicked out of the courtroom. Sixth Amendment right to counsel was violated there. People would argue that this is a cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment, but that's kind of more of a bonus thing. You can argue if you want to argue about it. I'm not an expert there. And then, of course, you have involuntary servitude under the 10th Amendment. Like, is it okay that this person is being confined, restrained, and forced to work? I think that might be unconstitutional. We have the 13th Amendment of holding her against her will, or maybe that's the involuntary servitude one. They work together, 10th and 13th. And then you have the 14th Amendment equal protection violation, where Britney was deemed, without a capacity declaration, to have some certain type of disability, dementia. And so because of a dementia diagnosis, without any medical capacity declaration by a doctor, without anybody coming in and doing an assessment in front of the judge, without even speaking to Britney, this diagnosis was stamped onto her file and allowed her to be treated differently under the law than she would without that diagnosis. It's arguable, and I believe that it is a violation of the 14th Amendment right to equal protection under the law, because Britney was delegated to a sort of secondary class citizen who had less rights than she did before she had this dementia diagnosis. And then you add on top of that the fact that the dementia diagnosis was never even verified. I mean, they've changed this diagnosis now from dementia to who knows, in the media TMZ is calling it bipolar. But again, in court, there's never been a capacity declaration filed. And so if you're, wanting the TLDR version of this, the big constitutional violations that happened in Britney's case were the right to due process. She had no notice that her rights were going to be taken away. She had no opportunity to be heard. And then her right to an attorney of her own choice, the Sixth Amendment. She had no ability to fight for herself. She was completely railroaded by this setup, and she did not have those constitutional protections afforded to her that frankly would have put her in a different position. We see what happens when the world is watching. Matthew Rosengart had to answer all of a half dozen questions, and that's Britney's new lawyer. So why is that the case today? And it wasn't the case in 2008. I mean, the Constitution is being followed a little bit here and there now, but ultimately, this conservatorship needs to be dissolved. It needs to be terminated without any evaluation because it was implemented without any true evaluation. Now we have this declaration by some doctor named James Sparr who's like besties with Andrew Wallet, and I don't know how much that's going to have to do with anything. We haven't seen it, but the Constitution wasn't followed in the implementation of this conservatorship. And so for us to skip around the theoretical mulberry bush about how we can get out of this is a little bit academically and intellectually dishonest, because it kind of forces us to reckon with a reality, or to live in a reality where we have to suspend common sense. And the common sense is Britney's conservatorship was implemented unconstitutionally. The conservatorship was implemented in utter opposition to the Constitution of the United States of America. And so for us to have to engage in these legal arguments as if this is something that she ever needed is academically and intellectually dishonest, because it wasn't. It was unconstitutional that it happened. And if the constitutional procedures would have been followed, Britney would probably never have been put into this conservatorship. But the person who tried the hardest to make the Constitution be followed, John Eardley Esquire, lost his law license when he tried to bring this up on constitutional grounds. And people said, maybe he wrote a bad check or something. Okay, listen. Writing a bad check is not enough to lose your law license. I think it might have been because he had uncovered the racket and he was the only one, and it was a lot easier to silence him than to reckon with what was really going on, which was a gross, perverse miscarriage of justice for which many, many judicial officers need to be held accountable.